Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going
My
to get
favorite
through
part
this.
is the Dave Rubin
Sounds like
one.
socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think
He said it.
that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
War hero Obama.
He's not my hero.
How
I'm not
heroic
fucking
he
idiot.
comes
If Bernie Sanders were
This part
president,
kind of
right?
confuses me.
And he wants
This
to bring
one?
the same ideas as for socialism into this country. Do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
Okay.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez said.
That's what the guy said. The guy says, that's what Hugo Chavez said.
worms in your brain.
And then she says, people have worms in your brain.
Oh,
Yeah. That's why it's funny. You know?
it loses its momentum right there,
Mm.
I think.
Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson. In this episode, I am sitting down with my friend Spencer Schecht. Spencer is a friend of mine from the Washington, D.C. area. We didn't meet in the sort of activist scene or community or anything like that. We actually met doing some music. And Spencer told me that he was listening to the podcast and that he had some questions and just kind of wanted to have a conversation. And since that's the point of the podcast, we sat down and had a pretty free-wielding conversation that, asked a lot of questions and might, repeat myself and sometimes from other episodes. But it's a good conversation in sort of how to talk about these issues among friends. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Spencer Schecht. Spencer, it's great to have you on the Sensible Socialist Podcast.
Thanks, Kevin. It's good to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
Okay, so there's two things I want to talk to you about. Okay. The first big thing is, you said you listened to a few episodes of this podcast,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to just get your impression and/or if there are lingering questions that you have about the way I sort of see this stuff or my kind of approach.
I want to ask you. I want you to take me back to the first time young Kevin said socialism.
Mm-hmm.
What's that?
Okay, I remember being in 12 or 13 years old, and my brother was in a band that were called the Pink Ski Bunnies, and they had a song where they just yelled social justice, and I was just like, what the hell are they talking about?
Oh my God, you're the right's worst nightmare.
Yeah.
You literally heard the phrase
social
and you're
justice.
convinced.
Yeah. So, but I was just like, what is this stuff? And then I came, that was right around the time that the internet, you could start searching around the internet and getting information that was not just what was fed to me at school and stuff like that.
Park me in that year. What time was that?
This would be 1998, 99, 2000
Word.
time frame. And it's definitely pre-September 11th. I know that for sure. Because, I was into punk rock. And I listened to bands like Anti-Flag and Propagandhi. And there's a lot of political messages in there that I didn't understand the references to. And so I sort of got somewhat acquainted with anarchism. And I've just been an anti-authority person. I don't really take orders very well and all that kind of stuff. And so I was always against authority. And the ultimate authority is the government. So I've always been anti-government. So in that sense, I've always been a libertarian kind of minded person.
So your earliest memories, anti-government, there's no one.
Yeah, it was very vaguely anti-government, sort of against the wars and against very much Ron Paul kind of, what you would hear from somebody who just got into libertarianism.
Right.
The government sucks and the government can't do anything right. And you stand too long in line at the DMV and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so, and then September 11th happened. And the Iraq War is starting to build up. And in that period of time between 2001 and 2003, I was in like 11th grade, and I took all the social studies classes. So I took like European history and American history, like AP American history, all those like advanced courses and stuff.
Those are my favorite courses.
Yeah, they were. I liked it. It was cool. It was fun to learn. But in retrospect, I was definitely being fed a narrative that was a ready-fit ideology to be pro-American. And I kind of recognized it as I was going through, but it was more just like anti-authoritarian, like the government always sucks. Like, the government sucks, the government sucks. And so I was in my debate class, 11th grade English class, that we had to do a debate. I wanted to do a debate that I knew I was going to lose, like one that was like an argument that was really hard to win.
Take the losing side on purpose.
Yeah, like so arguing for fascism or arguing for communism or something like that. So I thought, yeah, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to argue, because we had read like 1984 and we had read Animal Farm,
Sure.
So I'm like, all right,
yeah,
I got the ideology that like communism doesn't work. So let me argue that America should adopt a communist form of government.
That is a really important thing to point out, I think, because in retrospect, looking back at my education, there's definitely a pro-America, America triumph, America-centric narrative.
Absolutely. Through
all of our public education.
It goes back to the role of education in society,
general,
especially public education, right? Because so this is a government-run institution,
right?
Public education. So whose benefit? What is the goal of education, right? In a modern bourgeois capitalist republic, the goal is to make citizens who are not engaged enough to want unfettered democracy, but educated enough to be able to work in industrial skilled labor jobs.
And obedient.
Yeah, so like you don't want them to think that they want to have too much power, but they want to be able to go to work every day. Like that's the ideal. So you train them just enough to be smart enough to run a machine, but not smart enough to make decisions about their daily life. And our system does that perfectly. I mean, you have tons of people who have been given the ready-made ideology and accept it.
Yeah.
And that's why you have the giant middle of America who all basically have the same ideology.
If they just taught us to meditate in school and they made us do it every day, I think we'd all turn out so much better.
Did you ever have did you have critical reading or critical thinking class?
Critical thinking class. No, we had a literature class, an English class.
We had to like read books and then do book reports
and like
and
a
stuff.
critical analysis on that.
But never like how to think.
Right. I was really lucky when I was in high school. There was this program, I guess, in our school district called Natural Helpers.
Okay.
And you took a survey in gym class once a year. You would write down the people in your life that you trusted, that were classmates that you trusted if you had an issue. And if your name came up enough, you were selected to go on this weekend training. And it's like a little club. And it's a weekend getaway where you learn like this crash course on how to be a social worker, essentially, and how to listen to people and
resolve
a lot of the big messaging was not to give advice. And conflict resolution through discussion and being open to discussion. And if people come to you with heavy things or they come to you with emotionally charged things, how to deal with it and how to talk to them about it. And a lot of it was just asking them questions, letting them come to their own conclusions. Maybe a bit lawyerly even. But it was really cool and it was really impactful on me. And then we'd have this big sharing session. It was all confidential. You're not allowed to talk about it when you leave. And we'd get together, I think once a week or twice a month or something like that. The natural helpers would meet at school again, come together and we'd talk about life, and it was like kind of a opportunity for people to talk about things that they're not invited to talk about in other classes because they have an agenda of teaching trigonometry or Catcher in the Rye. And I remember there was this guy that was very inspiring to me, specifically on meditation, because he said he meditated every day. And when I went on the retreat, I saw him like walk to a dock and like sat and meditated for 20 minutes. And that was very impactful on me. I have no idea what he's up to now.
Like, okay, so do you think?
But I guess just to close that out, that was a very important experience for me because it was the softer side of things. There's the soft skills side of things. And like, I was really good at being a student and just taking in information and spitting it back out on the test. But I really needed that other avenue, that opportunity to like emotionally vent, learn tools for emotional like conflict and the hard stuff of day-to-day life, of emotions and people and relationships. And I was very grateful for that. But it makes me think now, thinking back, every kid should have that opportunity.
Well, yeah, and most don't. But because, again, I think if you're looking at the development of school curriculum, what's the most important thing? It's not really... it's people having their emotional disposition controlled enough so that they can get along with people, not a genuine understanding between people.
It's being told guidelines together. And then expectations and meeting the expectations to those guidelines.
Yeah, it's being able to say you have to work in a group, but the point of working in the group is not to have the group succeed. It's so that the group can accomplish the goal that it's been given. You know what I mean? It's not an organic collection of individuals that are doing something because of their shared mutual interest, or something that would like allow them to emotionally connect. Something like music, where you just sort of do it somewhat organically and you get together with people and then you make these bonds. It's different when you're talking about the groups that you work in school and places like that, because they're all just these small little groups that have been given an assignment.
It's an assembly line more than it is this organic.
It's showing how to work in a modern industrial facility.
But that group piece of it is interesting because we have to take all of our tests in school alone. Mm-hmm. The job I work in now, I'm always on a team. I work within a team of people, and if I'm unsure of something, I go and ask somebody, and that's where I thrive. I'm a real good team player, and I'm definitely able to tap into more of myself if I have a good team around me, which is maybe why I'm a good bandmate too. But why for years and years do they drill it into me? It's like, you got to know all your shit. You got to be totally sufficient in every single way.
It very much fits in with the general narrative of like rugged individualism and the sort of the sort of nonsensical idea that there's a meritocracy that we live in, right? That like we have to have some objective way of measuring everybody. Yeah. And like, here's the closest thing we have to an objective measure. So this is what we're gonna do. We're not gonna take into account different people's different social conditions or anything like that. There's this objective measure, and we're gonna evaluate everybody based on that measure, good, bad, or otherwise. It's very much again, a modern industrial kind of way of thinking, that here's the bar, and we're going to judge everybody based on that bar, because the bar is what is the best indicator for being functional in a modern.
I hear you. And I would, to play devil's advocate on this point specifically, there has to be some measuring stick that we use, and it has to be, everything has to be oversimplified to be implemented to some degree on that scale. But let's back up to 11th grade, where you're going to make an argument in English class.
Yeah, so I choose that I'm going to argue that the U.S. should adopt a communist form of government.
Ooh.
And everyone's just like, okay, great. And then, so I have to
You're
research.
Essentially auditioning for who you would be the rest of your life.
Basically, yeah, because I have to do the research, right? So I remember learning, Stalin is just as bad as Hitler. Communism doesn't work because it doesn't take into account human nature. All this sort of standard.
But you had to learn what it meant to be communist.
I actually picked up the Communist Manifesto and started reading. And when I was reading that, it was like, oh, well, this is like way different than what I remember learning about what communism was in Russia and stuff.
Well, I never read the Communist Manifesto. It's about time I do. But from what I understand, it's essentially this guy saying it's really unfair if we all don't take responsibility for ourselves. We all don't share in ownership of these things that we all produce together. Is that the idea?
So spoiler alert, one of the earlier episodes is I did an episode on the Communist Manifesto and actually read the thing, because it's not very long. It's like
Reddit for the podcast.
Reddit, yeah. So you can find it on there. But there's basically three parts of it, and the first part is basically the sort of background. the just saying like there are the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. You know, like the idea is like we're going to set out that class struggle is what we're going to look at.
That's part one. Mm-hmm.
And then and saying like there's been class struggle throughout history. We're in this new period of capitalist production, which is the bourgeois era, in which society is divided between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and that it comes with industry, and industry has this amazing thing where it overproduces. So we're so good at producing that we overproduce things.
Okay,
and it also has like fundamental problems like it's social production.
So it's rooted in the industrial age.
Yeah, because it comes out in right before there's revolutions in 1848, which is what basically moves almost all of Europe away from feudalism and into capitalism.
Yeah.
And so like the French were the first ones to do it in 1789, and by 1848, the rest of Europe has done it. And so the Communist Manifesto comes right before 1848 because there's been capitalist production happening. And people have seen the results of capitalist production. Like,
what does capitalist production look like in 1800 in France? Does that just mean the industrialization of products and services?
It means a bunch of people who used to work on farms moving into cities and then going to work in growing factories,
right,
making commodities like, you know, whether it's clothes or
urbanization,
steel or something like that. So the steel for railroads and doing all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So you're talking about people who used to be agricultural workers who start going to cities and work in factories. And so that is the industrial working class, which is different than the agricultural working class. So it's this industrial working class that even in the Communist Manifesto, Marx says they're the new system that already exists in the old system. Because when the previous systems, a new mode of production, a new way of producing things comes into being, the old social structure and mode of production that used to exist doesn't work anymore. It fucks up. And what happens is usually because society is divided between two groups of people, those that have and those that own and control production, and those people who usually work in production,
right,
that there's one of two things that happen. Either the class that's exploited and oppressed overtakes the class that was oppressing them and becomes the new ruling class, or both classes die out and the society like just crumbles.
Those are the only two options?
It's really the only two ways that it can happen, because the productive forces, the development of productive forces that human beings, like, this is one of our natural tendencies to like be more productive, to like ever do things more efficiently and effectively. Right. And like,
that's almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As an individual, you know, we're always, as soon as we're competent and safe in one way, we want to go to the next level.
Exactly. Yeah. And like, and the higher the levels you go, the more like sort of interesting and fulfilling the things are that you get to do.
Mm-hmm. But as a society, it plays out in this way that you're talking about.
Right. And the changes, when one class takes over another class, that's a revolutionary change.
Sure.
And so if you look at 1848 and 1789, 1776 here, those revolutions are where the bourgeoisie, the people who are like owning the factories that are developing, overtake the old feudal systems, the monarchies and stuff like that, so that they could then run the societies and create laws and a whole social system that fits the needs of industrial capitalism as compared to like feudalism. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's like, and that those took place in revolutions of bourgeoisie against the monarchies, mm-hmm, and the representations of feudalism. So that's why you have the King of France getting his head cut off by the new emerging ruling class, the bourgeoisie. So they create, and so this is the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah, this is but just to pause it right here, that's a very interesting place to come in and talk about how America, mm-hmm, although we were birthed out of a revolution against a monarchy, we ourselves started out monarchy-less.
Yeah, I mean, I think America is the first bourgeois republic. Mm. So like, it's a republic not of nobles. There's no really nobility in the United States. It's people who own production. So whether that's agricultural production in the South, that, you know, the big planters, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. They're giant owners of slaves and things property, which in the South is capital. And in the North, it's people who are silversmiths and things like that. People who own production, merchants, people like that. That's the bourgeoisie. So America is the first bourgeois republic. That's why, like, 1/3 of one. So 1/3 of the government of the United States of America is democratic. So just the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is supposed to represent the people, the sort of general, the rabble. And then the Senate is supposed to represent the wealthy and the cooler heads and the people who have wealth and stake in the society. That's the original intent. Then the president is elected, but then it appoints an entire branch of government on his own. And then the
presidency started out as almost like a spokesperson role. It's like the powers that we associate with the president now, and even the word president, the connotation is big and powerful.
Yeah, it's basically a monarch.
Right. Then they had chosen president as this way of saying almost like a bean counter. And it's like, you're here in this role.
Somebody who'd like, you can just do foreign policy. Like, you make the treaties, we'll ratify them, but like, other than that, just like leave us alone, The point is that the United States is an amazing revolution against feudal monarchy, but it has this revolutionary exuberance, and then it immediately pulls back and becomes conservative, and establishes a very rigid bourgeois democracy that's very controlled, very managed democracy, managed by the people.
The spirit is still that one of revolution and individuality, and
so that's the irony. So there's two large problems with the American Revolution. The first is slavery. So you have this all men created equal bullshit and all this rhetoric about equality, liberty, freedom, justice, while an entire race is being held in chattel slavery, right? So and then instead of emancipating the slaves at the end of the Revolutionary War to show that, like, yes, we actually mean what we say, they kept slavery as part of the fucking Constitution.
Right.
So that's the first part that like makes the American project a little sullied at the beginning.
Sure.
And takes a war.
How are we teaching that in class today? Because it's like we sort of talked about a little bit when we were growing up in public school, but I wonder what kids today are learning about slavery.
I do wonder. I would hope that the education system has progressed a little bit, but again, what is the point in learning the depths of the sin that was committed in terms of not releasing slavery?
Yeah.
Right? It's a very deep scar, and like there's a lot of people, especially conservative people, who want to argue we don't need to be teaching kids this anti-American, kind of rhetoric that yes, America makes mistakes, but look, we had a civil war that fixed the issue, and then we had,
that's just oversimplified thinking.
We had this civil rights movement, so like we fixed it, right? So like what I think a lot of people, what I remember learning, and I think what a lot of people learn now is like there were these mistakes, but the mistakes have been corrected. And so America right now,
and that's sort of what I got growing up in the 90s. I was thinking about that, what it was like to be in elementary school. And it was a lot of this idea of, we figured out all the bad shit. We got that Holocaust thing out of our system. We got that that Cold War. Yeah, we got that nuclear armament up to our teeth figured out. We didn't even talk about it. Like, I didn't even know. I was born in 89. So that was right when all the tensions kind of fizzled out. So I was born right at the end of all that Cold War tension, and it's such important context for the state of things today. But yeah, as far as we're talking 1996, 7-year-old Spencer, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, like growing up, thinking, wow, we got a handle on all the real bad shit.
Yeah,
we just like all the atrocities are done with because now we're smart, or rather like enlightened. We figured this all out, and everyone's got computers now. But it's this sort of kind of maybe coming of age moment where you look around and think, okay, things aren't
peachy,
awful, but they could be so much better. And it's just like these gross inefficiencies, these gross institutional problems, and just very obvious ways that things could be better. I know I'm talking kind of like too general, but it's like this realizing we don't have the good stuff figured out yet, like the important stuff. It's like we vaccinate, we've got toilets that work, and people aren't dying in the street because of violence. And
Progress has been made.
Yeah, when we got that baseline figured out, and now about prosperity and like quality of life. And what's interesting is that we live in an age now where outwardly we are very well off, and inwardly we are tortured, and mental illness is rampant, and the social media is affecting children and adults in these really intense, psychologically impactful ways. It's an interesting time to be alive, and just thinking about the human nature in general.
So, okay, you've opened a few doors, but I want to go through one that you didn't quite open, right? Which is, so the last thing that you touched on, that I think that what's so cool to me about Marxism, right, is that there are like 3 or 4 really big ideas that are really, really helpful to understand things. So like one of them is the whole dialectical materialism, that like you just look at the material conditions of a society, you check out the economic base, you understand the dynamics of the economic base and how the superstructure like feeds into that. And so the culture and the ways that people relate to each other and all these kinds of things can be like associated with a certain kind of mode of production. And that helps you understand former societies and present societies. That's a really helpful one. Another one is the sort of general critique of capitalism in terms of overproduction and creation of crises and all this kind of stuff.
With that, this is good then to go all the way back to that 3 main parts of the Communist Manifesto, right? Is that
this is exactly part of it. The third part of the manifesto is like what the communists actually want, which is interesting. It's like the progressive income tax, the nationalization of banks. It's like very concrete proposals that doesn't sound like super utopian, like we just want everybody to get along. It's like, we just want like progressive income taxes and like public education.
Very specific action steps.
Very, very like, this is what we're for.
Progressive income. So yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that they have policy prescriptions written in
the third part of the manifesto. There's policy. So
the progressive income tax seems smart.
Yeah, I don't know them by heart, but like it's essentially what we would see as progressivism. That would eventually, so this is like 1848. By 1900, this is what like Woodrow Wilson would argue for, or Theodore Roosevelt, something like labor protections, things like that, like strong labor unions, the ability to like that you can't be fired for trying to join a union, things like that.
What I just learned from that was saying a progressive income tax, you can say that's communism.
Yeah. That's a communist proposal.
It's a communist proposal.
Yeah, but it's also, arguably the engine of economic growth between 1945 and 1975 that helped create an entire industrial middle class in the United States, where you were like well-paid labor and all this kind of stuff. It was pretty. So it's got interesting, a history in terms of those specific proposals. But the other thing that is really helpful is the whole idea of alienation. Alienation. Or like estrangement is another way that it's sometimes translated. And it comes from like Hegel, and that's like a German philosopher that Marx got a lot of shit from. But the idea of alienation is that the average worker, the everyday worker in a capitalist enterprise knows that they're just being paid wages. They don't have any ownership stake in the business. They don't have any real ability to like control how things are done. They don't decide what's produced, how it's produced, where it's produced, what's done with the profits. They just go to work. They feel very they're atomized. They're just part of the machine. The more and more industry develops and creates assembly lines and all this kind of stuff, the more and more atomized the individual gets, the more and more like a machine they feel.
Interchangeable.
And even in like, the sort of high end kind of things like that, it's like even developers of software, it's like you are, an individual with certain talents and stuff like that, but you're also replaceable. You know what I mean? So there's like you
have a role, and you could be fired from that role, and someone else will.
There's a labor market, and somebody's nipping at your heels, and we all know all this kind of stuff, and it really bums us the fuck out. We all feel kind of crappy about this. A lot of us don't like what we do. A lot of us would do different things if we didn't have to do it for money. A lot of us are unhappy. We try to get away from as much work as we can. We go to happy hour at 5:00 because all the other hours are sad hours. Like there's a lot of, we all kind of understand this basic alienation, but it creeps into so many different things, and it can do things like fuel a mental health crisis. You know, I mean, I honestly think that a lot of my own personal mental health issues are very much related to my job situation and the relationship I had at work. Because if that's not good, the rest of your life falls apart.
It's such an integral part in how we have to participate in society.
Exactly.
40 hours of your week, spending more time with coworkers than you do with family.
When someone asks you what you do, you usually don't say your hobby.
Right.
You say what you do for a living. So what do you do for money? You know, and what you get paid for. And so that defines who you are. You know, and this is a whole other idea that comes from Marx too. Like, you know, we are human beings with all of these different kinds of dispositions. We all have different abilities and talents, and they're directed in different ways.
It sounds almost spiritual.
There's a whole aspect of it that's like, we just want to free the individual from the bondage of wage slavery. Because the one of the things that, like, there was a lot of people who were in Germany and other places in 1848 who were acquainted with these ideas that eventually went over to the United States and fought like the Civil War and stuff like that. And they would say things like, yeah, let's an end to chattel slavery where one person owns their laborer, and then an end to wage slavery where we rent them. When you look at
So we're talking about alienation.
Yeah, when you look at that pervasive sense of alienation, in the United States, you have suicide rates that are going up.
Well, actually, but I'm curious because when he wrote about alienation 170 years ago, I know the examples of alienation you're giving me relevant to today are very accurate. But what sort of alienation was he talking about then?
The same kind. People drinking too much. There was like in Dickensian England, there was a whole thing like that in America too. That's why you get prohibition.
Right.
There's people who drinking their fucking ass off because they go to work at 12-hour shifts. They get off work and all they want to do is have, a drink. And then when they feel a little bit better after the first one, and then they have, 6 more drinks, they're drunk as fuck. They have to wake up, they got a hangover the next day, and they just do this constantly until they're ground into dirt.
Right.
And this happened, like, there's this whole temperance idea that, like, we have to get rid of alcohol because that's the social sin. It's like, no, there's this deep sense of alienation happening that's causing people to drink or causing people
sort of like what's happening. We had the meth outbreak in the early 2000s in the Midwest, and we have opioids today.
Yeah, I mean, even a lot of like racial tension, I think, can go back to this idea of like there being, a pitting of the two bits of the working class against each other.
Yeah, and
a fueling of that feeling of alienation. Like you're one slip up away from losing your job, or we're going to bring in, black folks who are going to work for less money, and we're going to lower your wages, and they're going to do all this kind of stuff that make people terrified and frustrated. And we don't usually make the best decisions about our own mental health and our own physical health when we're terrified of losing our job and alienated while we're at it.
The thing that I am always remembering about my own personal perception of all of that is privilege, that I was born into a really good situation overall. And I went through hardships for sure that I'm glad that I went through that made me who I am today. But yeah, it was sort of like being given a step stool to reach higher shelves when I know other people were started off in a hole rather than even on solid ground.
Yep.
And recognizing that makes it really difficult. But the bigger questions, what I think about when I see homeless people on the street talking to themselves, and they're not. I wonder if every society inherently will have. Isn't this Jordan Peterson idea that hierarchy is inherent? Right,
yes.
That like we'll always have the lowest of the low, we'll always have the highest of the high, and that all attempts at kind of like trying to leveling that don't work out. I think that's what his argument is, and I wonder about that too, because we've got a lot of opportunities for people, and of course we can be better. But I think I wonder if there were always homeless people, even if you go back to ancient Egypt, if there were still the poorest of the poor.
So Jordan Peterson's thing is like, there's always hierarchies. So you just have to understand the hierarchy. And I think it's an important distinction between a natural hierarchy and an unnatural hierarchy, right? So like your ability to play the bass guitar compared to my ability to play the bass guitar exists on a hierarchy. You are better at it than I am. The ability to play the drums is also on a hierarchy. I am better at it than you are. So That's a natural hierarchy. It's a natural hierarchy because of our dispositions are different.
But also time investment.
I
invested
decided
into it. Yeah.
I decided based on all kinds of different conditions. I mean, this can go back into a discussion of whether or not even free will exists. So let's assume for the sake of this argument that free will. Well, I don't think the free will does exist. So like, let's just say that like all of the atoms that were in my body and all the different things just happened to go in the way so that I decided, or I felt like I decided that I was going to put the time and energy in to become better at drums than you did, or that you went a different way.
Yeah.
Right? That has created a natural hierarchy, right? We can't, even if we rewound the tape and played it back again, that would still exist.
A natural hierarchy seems, the word that I would like to use is like emergent. This idea of there's many chaotic conditions happening and many variables, and what came out of that for you was a lot of time behind a drum set, and for me was a lot of time with a guitar.
Maybe. I'm not. Yeah. That would be my way of saying.
We said
like,
we weren't going to go down the hole, but we are.
Like in terms of the free will thing. Okay, maybe either it's determinate or it's emergent. It doesn't feel much different depending on what it is, so I don't really care.
Yeah,
like,
but going on.
Feeling on
but yeah,
that.
so natural hierarchy.
So it feels like I made that
drums
decisions. And
better.
like that's something that it doesn't. What it ultimately means is though that one, in terms of the value of those two things, it's relative. We exist on a hierarchy in terms of who can play bass better. But in terms of the value of that as compared to other things, it's neutral. It doesn't really matter. It's a choice. It's a difference. So then there are unnatural hierarchies. So I think that in terms of like generally your material conditions, so like if you have wealthy parents, you are likely to stay wealthy. If you have poor parents,
right,
you are likely to stay poor.
Right.
Okay, so that is an unnatural hierarchy because it's not based on your natural disposition and your choices, your individual choices. We're not starting at the same position, right? Relative to playing the bass, you and I started at the same position, right? Like it just so happened that your whatever went into making your decision to do the bass and the time invested in you, it created a difference between us in terms of our ability and the bass guitar.
Okay.
How much money that we have when we're born because of our parents' relative wealth is not something that we start at the same place on, that anyone starts at like the same place. Everyone's position is different. And it's a lottery. It's complete luck or not, or lucky or unlucky.
Right.
Oh, you had like rich parents, well you got lucky. You had poor parents, well you got unlucky. It's not a hierarchy that exists because of the decisions that a person makes. It's one that already exists when they're born. So it's unnatural. It doesn't come out of, like Jordan Peterson always talks about this too, where you want to have equality of opportunity. Yeah, that's what the irony of that is, that communists want equality of opportunity. We don't want equality of outcome, right? It's not, we would just want everybody to be able to participate in society and on an equal footing, where you won't have things like, because my dad was rich, I'm also rich.
So what would that look like implemented today? So today, end of work hours already. It's Sunday even. So tomorrow, Monday morning, what does a communist solution to society's woes as they are today look like?
So, caveat, fundamentally, I would think that a post-class communist society where there are no class divisions in society would be fundamentally democratic, and therefore the individual way in which things are organized will vary depending on the tendencies of people in various places. So not every place in a communist society will be the same, just like not every place in the capitalist world is the same. Israel is a capitalist bourgeois republic like the United States, but it's very different than the United States.
Sure, okay, but don't dodge the question.
I'm just making the caveat, okay? So one way it could work would be the following, right? So let's say we live in Washington, D.C., okay? Washington, D.C. would be considered a commune, and the way that it would work is that it would have a city council, it would have a commune, let's say, and that commune would be representative of some way of fairly representing the people. So some geographic distribution, somewhat like it is now, and then also the ability to have different workplaces, different sectors of the people who work in the city would also be able to come into this legislature. And the goal of the legislature would basically to make sure that there's an efficient functioning of the local economy, right? And it would also connect itself to other cities and states and other kind of jurisdictional things to make sure that there's an efficient functioning of the overall, literally worldwide economy. But then if we focus back down on Washington, D.C. and the individual worker, right? In all of the industries, the individual worker would likely take some sort of public transportation or some, there would essentially be a way of getting to and from the work site. This is, I would, like in a real late stage kind of communist thing, you could possibly have no money. So you simply go to the public transport thing, or you could easily call like some kind of pod that would be an electric vehicle that would come and pick you up and take you to where you need to be. But you go to the work site and you would have a position at the work site and you would fill your role and you would work with your coworkers. And, to me, I would think that either at part of every day or one day a week, you would get together with your coworkers and discuss how the business is doing. This is what we did this week. This is what we did that week. Make any decisions we need to make, and then implement those decisions and work collectively with the coworkers. When the business makes if there is money exchanged, if it makes any money, we get that money. If it doesn't make the money, we figure out what we need to do. If you don't have money, then you would engage in these enterprises, and if people are using whatever it is that you're producing, then you are successful. And if they're not, then you find something else to do because your labor is otherwise wasted. Understand this, and this is one thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is the yang connection. Is also
yang connection.
Yeah, the yang connection is automation.
Yeah,
I really think that automation is the thing that is going to push the capitalist mode of production into that thing when it really comes into conflict with
that's exactly right.
the existing social order. And I think Andrew Yang has done a very good job of identifying that kind of thing is going to happen. The problem for me is that he just doesn't go the next step in terms of putting it into the rest of that sort of Marxist concept.
He couldn't, doing what he's running for president. He's not saying our automation will usher in a communist utopia. He has to cut that in half, and that's what he's done.
Yuval Noah Harari has said something similar to that.
Yeah, and I think that in more or less, so I love that description of what a communist society could be.
Democratic in every way.
Right.
At the workplace, at your home, at school.
But to some degree, I feel like I'm living in a version of that currently.
How?
And that I live in a group house, and we have collective decision making.
Do you own the house together?
No, we do not.
All right.
Yeah. So that's a piece of it, because I still have half of what you're talking about. The ownership thing is its own conversation, but then I go to work and I don't own that. I work at a nonprofit, but I am in a role and then have put in my time and demonstrated to the people in charge that I can speak with some authority on where I think we should go, and that is weighed to the merit of my reputation as well as what I've proven in my proven action record. So I think that meritocracy that exists at the work that I have now, it scratches that itch of owning it just enough. It sounds.
You don't own anything, though.
I guess you're right in ownership wise. It's a wage labor, but in terms of direction and vision of it. But I guess maybe I'm just justifying. Excuse me. Maybe. Yeah, I guess ownership wise, you're right. Yeah, I don't own.
Like you might feel like you have some modicum of control, but you definitely don't have ownership, right? And I think for me, that's really the important kind of thing is like having
American
ownership
dream
and control.
is ownership, though, individual ownership, though. So I own a company, Green Drinks, and that has been very empowering and sort of participating in the economic system as it's set up now, and seeing it a little bit like monopoly.
What do you mean by that?
In that it's contrived in that we have to do something. There is no inherent thing that's best. And the system that we're participating in works well enough. And again, the privilege that I was born into, it's worked for me.
Yeah.
I recognize that there's many, many other people that are alive today and have been alive that weren't afforded that. But in my day-to-day, I still feel like I'm contributing to that better world.
Aren't you just benefiting from the all the costs that have been paid? Like the way I look at it though is instead of, my relative position compared to people who had it worse off, I really look at the price that was paid for the sort of development enough to even have somebody to live the life that I live. And it's immense. Like the cost that's been paid in human lives and environmental destruction and all kinds of exactly. That the cost that's been paid to even give the ability to have the kind of, and I don't even have like as privileged a life as the most privileged person does, but the fact that the price is still being paid by people, to me, is what is intolerable, which is why I am fighting for a change in the entire mode of production so that we can rid ourselves of I think the reasons why we have all of these problems. I think, to me, I don't understand how anyone, not you, the proverbial you, could be an environmentalist and not be like a socialist, or at least an anti-capitalist. Because it seems relatively obvious to me that, like, in terms of the environment, like, so there's lots of like human destruction, but like if you focus just on the environment, the cost that's been paid in the destruction to the environment for capitalist development and the consequences thereof in terms of the standard of living that some people might have is potentially civilization destroying.
Sure. And
so to fight climate change and to fight against for the environment generally, to me it seems like you have to be against the system that produced the problem and the one that continues to perpetuate it.
That's an interesting distinction to make, because I don't think about it as an action or actions perpetrated by the system of capitalism. I conceptualize that as the collateral of progress in general, and that if the system had been communist, it might have been less destructive, might have been more destructive. But the progress that it took humanity, regardless of the system, to get to where it is today, there's a quote inscribed in the Jefferson Memorial. It's really, it's great. It's obviously the reason they chose one of them to put it there. And he was talking about laws being like a coat. You put a coat on when you're a child versus you put it on when you're an adult. You don't wear that coat anymore. You need a new coat. And like laws are like coats, and it has to keep up with stuff. And I love that quote. It's just saying, like, stay current. What was old might have been true. Today it might not be true anymore.
The irony of us still interpreting the Constitution written in the 1780s seems a little stupid.
Well, to throw it in your face, the Communist Manifesto is written in 100 years later.
It needs to be updated.
Yeah.
That's the cool thing about Marxism, though, is that it's decidedly the irony of the sort of 20th century example of Marxism is that Marxism is supposed to not be like a religion. It's not supposed to be utopian. It's not supposed to be there's not supposed to be these gods and idols. And what happened in the 20th century is that you had very much the distortion of Marxism into this state religion, where you had these Christ-like figures.
Like Stalin and
Mao
what's going on
and Lenin
in North Korea currently.
Exactly, yeah. So in like that even is like the most like express example of this like deification.
This is a good topic because a lot of people would say communism and they'd say you want to live like you do in North Korea. So what's your response to that argument?
North Korea would itself say it's not a communist country. It has a particular ideology called Juche, which is very much about self-reliance and the Workers' Party, the Korean Workers' Party controlling the entire economy and regulating it in order to maintain self-sufficiency against imperial endeavors by all kinds of places.
What about things like Maoist purges and Stalin purges, and a lot of people talk about mass murder in communist countries?
The way that I look at this comes from a Yugoslav. He was like a member of the Yugoslav communists, and he was in the higher echelons of the party and things like that. His name was Milovan Žilas, and he basically described it as saying, okay, in the Marxist ideology, you go to a new stage of production, a new mode of production, when the conditions of the place that you're in have made the current system outdated. They don't fit the development of productive forces, right? Like in the former society, when you had industrial production overtaking agricultural production, you needed a new society to fit that, which is the capitalist society. Now we're getting into an age where it's going to be technological, and so we need a new society that's going to fit that technological age. I would argue that needs to be socialist. That, I think, is what Marx sort of argued, that when capitalism will develop its own, the contradictions in capitalism will develop, that you have environmental devastation and the potential destruction of the entire working class through automation, that we're going to need a new system that's going to be able to fit that and be able to use the productive forces that have developed to progress society and human beings and civilization forward. So it's going to be the places where capitalism has developed fully that's going to be able to go to communism first, because communism is just the next stage of development, where you get out of the division of society based on who owns and who controls the production and who works at it, because everyone is going to work and own and control the production. So it's going to do away with that old division, right?
So you won't have a dictator who could say,
no,
eliminate this entire village.
Exactly, no, because you'd have a really developed capitalist system. You'd have a giant industrial working class. You'd have most of the people working for wages, in cities and stuff like that. So he's thinking the United States, England, Germany. Then you look at the most backward economies at the time, Russia, China, all these things. They hadn't even developed capitalist production yet. They were still feudal, things that had gone away in Europe in the 1850s. So Russia was just not ready for a communist revolution. There were all these ideas that we could just jump over the capitalist stage of development, and that's not what Marx said, and it certainly doesn't appear to be possible, because what happens is communism becomes the way that the country industrializes. So you take non-industrial countries and you say we're gonna become communist, and we're gonna do so by having a single party, the Communist Party, take over and run the whole thing. Well, what did those communist parties do? What did they do in Russia? What did they do in China? What did they do in Korea and other places where the Communist Party took over? They took agricultural feudal societies and in the period of 20 to 30 years made them into industrial superpowers, which is what happened. So communism in the 20th century context really is a stand-in for rapid industrial development to facilitate the establishment of a capitalist economy. So Russia takes 30 years and then tries to manage this bullshit economy, creates a state capitalist system, and that deteriorates and becomes a private capitalist system. China does a similar kind of process where it develops this state managed thing, but it's a state capitalist kind of thing where the state is employing people. The workers aren't controlling anything in these regimes. So the example of the 20th century in terms of what communism is not what Marx was talking about. He was talking about places like the United States and England and Germany with long traditions of democratic development, being able to say, look, what we want to do is make democracy at the workplace. And true, the French Revolution, the three ideals of the French Revolution, equality, fraternity, and liberty. Nowhere in the world do we have those real things, like this real sense of brotherhood, this real sense of being free, because we live in dictatorships at work. And so all that communists ever want is the real expression of freedom, democracy, and solidarity among people. And so if you look at the 20th century, the communist regimes of the 20th century do not represent the idea of true freedom, true equality, and true brotherhood. And so they're not communist regimes. They might be communist regimes run by a communist party, but the Communist Party, the idea that you can have a revolution that makes the whole working class rise up against their own masters at work and own and control the productive forces in a democratic way is not what happened in Russia or China or anything like that, or Korea or other places like that. They have a much different, like a different trajectory. So they're not good examples of what we mean by communism. That's the very long version of the not real communist fallacy that people say. Why hasn't communism ever worked? And you have to say, well, because it was never real communism. But that's the not real communism argument.
Okay.
Yep. But that's...
They didn't communist hard enough.
They were not ready for communism.
What was it? What would you describe it as then? So they said they were communists, and like that's the whole joke of talking about Comrade Russia. Like everything was just. So you're saying they didn't get it right?
Russia in 1905, when it had its first revolution, and then two in 1917, had an industrial working class population that was like 10% of the entire population. Like 90% of the population lived on farms in the middle of nowhere.
Sure.
Right? So the industrial working class in the sort of Marxist idea is supposed to be the engine of revolutionary development and going to be the class that overtakes the bourgeois class and institutes a classless society. If it's going to do that, it's got to be at least a majority of the population. If you look at the United States, the majority of the population are are part of the industrial working class, or part of the general. Like now, we're sort of post-industrial, so we're part of the larger working class.
Yeah.
Anybody who works for wages.
Sure. But I think that there is also a distinction in what it means to work and to put in a hard day's work. In 1849, was that the year it was published?
The Communist Manifesto, like 1846, I think it was. Don't quote me.
So
1850.
Yeah. 1850, that what it means to work versus what it means for me to go to work. Tomorrow I'm going to go to work and I'm going to sit behind a computer and I could stay seated that entire time. And I'm going to go eat in the middle of the day. And if I need a long break, I can do that if I need it.
Why do you think there's been that progress? Who's been advocating for work life to get less shitty? Capitalists? No, it's been the socialist. It's been like here's the thing that really fucks the whole thing up with like Marx, is that Marx had this this idea that explains how things had developed previous to that, and then he injects himself in the middle of that kind of development and puts the idea out there. So then a bunch of people are like, see, all we have to do is make that kind of shit. We just have to force it down the throats of people, and then it'll just work. Right? And so Marx didn't realize, or couldn't have realized, the impact that his enunciating these ideas were going to have in the development of how things were going to go, the development of like history. So things after Marx were not going to develop as Marx described, because Marx had been injected into the scene. So you have this idea, this ready-made idea that can allow people to progress and understand what's going on in society and try to manipulate it. So you have these revolutionaries who want this good end goal of like a classless society and want to just jam their society or their civilization through that because they have these lofty good ideas about the better society that it would be, without wage slavery and the worker-owner relationship.
That society has come back around and influenced itself and changed itself.
Exactly.
Then where does it have to evolve to keep up? Or what do you need to distinguish between what communism was when it first dropped in 1850 versus what it is today?
That's why I like the fully automated luxury space communism. You've heard that? There's people say fully automated luxury gay space communism. So
Gay space communism.
so exactly, you added the gay in there, but like the way that so if you break it down, like fully automated,
okay,
luxury, gay, and we'll just add that in there for fun. Space communism. The idea being, okay, so let's look at some of the dynamics that we see all the time, right? So this brings in the Andrew Yang, the Elon Musk, and all this kind of shit, because you have the serious development of potentially interplanetary rockets and the interplanetary capability.
That's the gay part.
That's the gay part. Exactly. You have already significant process into the fully automated part of it, where there's so much automation happening that I think a lot of people are going to be doing in the later half of the 21st century is doing a lot of data science kind of stuff and being able to automate things that we couldn't imagine being automated right now, including healthcare and a lot of different things that would seem like these high prestigious jobs. My field of work, lawyer, that's totally going to get automated away. I can already see it.
Yeah, but then that's an interesting point that you already acknowledged that, and most people would point to lawyer as one of the highest jobs that would be invincible from automation.
No, it's probably something like mural painting. That is going to be the thing that demands human beings. It'll be music making, and even then, that's probably going to get automated quite a bit. There's very little that human beings don't do that can't be automated. It's going to force us to be incredibly. We're either going to be creative or be explorers and challenge ourselves, because that's the only thing we're going to do.
That sounds great. Yeah, I mean, if I could design a great life, I'd be making music a lot and going on hikes.
That's the luxury. There's the luxury part of it too.
Sure.
Right? The idea is that fully automated, luxury, gay space communism. So it's going to be using automation to create a luxury.
The Jetsons. It's going to be a
luxury lifestyle that is.
Why haven't we rebooted that?
I'm like, yeah, exactly. It could be, I mean, I did one episode of it where on this where the closest example you have is Star Trek.
Right.
There's no money in Star Trek, and they live in a post-scarcity society where apparently you don't need money.
So this is, to kind of bring it back home a little bit.
From Star Trek.
Yeah, from Star Trek to just, I describe myself as a techno-optimist.
Okay.
A that technology is evolving.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm optimistic that it will be a positive rather than a negative. And they're like, to take that and break it down even further. Elon Musk had this great talk where he was talking about why going to Mars with SpaceX. And he said, when we went to the moon 50 years ago, we thought that was just the beginning, when in fact that was the peak. And every iteration, at least from America, after that was a decrease in capability. And he was saying essentially that he wanted to jumpstart the space future that everyone wanted.
Mm-hmm.
That they thought the Apollo program was kicking off, not that was the peak. That was the climax of it already. So he was making the point that things just don't get better just because it's not the natural state of things. It could flounder. And he was trying to say that space travel has lost its excitement and it's floundering, and we need to be excited about space travel again, in that we should be capable of it. And he is an insane comic book character that is almost sheer will forcing innovation in space travel and manifesting technology at this crazy rate.
He's leading a team of people who are doing that.
That's very true. But I guess the broader point that I'm trying to make is I'm optimistic in that, and I'm optimistic in things getting better to the point where I think, from what it sounds like, my version of what a really safe and fulfilling future for humanity could be sounds pretty communist, and that everyone's taken care of, and that we don't everything's going to be so well done and taken care of, and that if the software and the algorithms and the artificial intelligence are all working for us, that it would be the ultimate mycelium of communism. It would bring it all together, and it would, by sake of being alive, you're brought into this web that takes care of its own.
So what is your source of optimism? I mean, to me, the thing is like, I don't have the optimism because I don't see the existence of a large, at least in the United States, a large like socialist movement to keep the progression going forward. I mean, I think since you've had the elimination of the socialist and radical left in the United States in the 50s and 60s after Vietnam, you've had this gap now where you've had, the rollback of different things, and unions are, a lot less people are in unions and all this kind of stuff that without the socialist left.
You're saying that like the unions fought for it and now everyone's so comfortable with it, they're like, what do we need unions for anymore?
But it's partly that. I mean, unions are also corrupt and have ties to the Democratic Party and all that kind of stuff. But like
up on Long Island, people knew you getting a union job.
Yeah, I mean, there's corruption that happens there because the unions are fundamentally there to maintain the capitalist dynamic. A union is there to negotiate is to be the body by which the employees negotiate with the boss.
So this is again the argument unions. That they're not communisming hard enough. Yeah, is again what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean the labor unions in the United States are specifically anti-communist. When you talk about purges, the funny thing is there's purges in the Soviet Union and stuff like that. There were purges of communists of American unions. Samuel Gompers, that was the head of the AFL, literally made a decree that was like, we have to get all these communists out of our unions. So America has a strong communist tradition that in some ways ended in the 1970s and 80s for various amount of reasons, including FBI infiltration and all kinds of counterintelligence program activities that broke up a lot of the different groups, and then infighting between them and the break of the Soviet Union and all kinds of things are the reason that you have a very scattered, fragmented left at the moment. But you don't have them. So where is the optimism that this development that we see in like automation, all that kind of stuff, isn't just going to further the inequality and make, another Jeff Bezos as compared to a society, one that could do all this kind of stuff in the social interest, in the sort of tech utopia that you were sort of talking about, that would be equivalent to communism.
Yeah, everyone wants to pull out, I'd say let's look at the numbers, right? And Steven Pinker's idea is that when you plot all the important stuff, the general trend is that there's been progress, and there is progress.
Why?
Why has there been progress?
Who's responsible for the progress? It's not just progress because it happens. There's an agent. There has to be, right? There's got to be some agent by which that progress is happening. That's the thing I don't.
But what are you
like
saying?
Steven Pinker's. I like Steven Pinker's the whole like, look, it's not as bad as it used to be. A lot of people used to die from disease and stuff like that. He's right. There's been lots of development, and it's great.
Yeah.
But the thing is, people are still paying the cost when they don't have to. That's the issue. And the other question is, so that's one criticism. But the other one is, who's making the change? Why has there been progress? What's been so different in the last 100 years when a lot of this progress has been made that it wasn't there before, right? Because there's some reason, I guess, why this progress is being made. It's not just happening.
There was progress and innovation in the 20th century, both in the Soviet Union, a communist, or as you say, a quasi-communist.
State capitalist.
Yeah, state. And in the United States. And so if you're actually claiming then there was actually no real communism, then there has been centuries of progress without communism.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so then your question of like where's progress come from? What are you saying that progress is coming from?
I think that industrial development does come with progress when there is an organized working class movement, let's say. So either that comes in the form of like a strong union movement or a left-wing labor party, So the reason that you have the establishment of one of the best welfare states in the world in Sweden is because you have a party that was connected, a labor party that was connected to a strong union movement that had very strong socialist ideas.
Well, the last 100 and 150 years have been an age of incredible progress.
Yes.
So, but you're saying that that's derived from an organized working class fighting?
The progress that's been made, because without that pressure, the capitalist mode of production.
I guess
would
what I mean
grind
by
people to a
progress is the invention of the transistor and the distribution of technologies.
Oh, that's all because of state development. Then that's all state directed. So that kind of development. Okay, so I thought you meant like even if you look at medical development and technological development are all because of state investment. It's not private companies investing these kinds of things. It's a military focused Cold War kind of push to develop these new and emergent technologies.
What about the iPhone? Because the
iPhone is completely made of technology developed by state investment. It's simply a compilation of a lot of technology that was developed at universities and different places that got grants from the Natural Science Institute and other places like that.
Okay, so then
the private market takes advantage of development that happens because of state direction. If the state didn't do it, you'd have a stagnant economy that would simply go bust and that would go up and down and wouldn't progress. You wouldn't have had even the establishment of modern capitalist economies without state-directed like creations of railroads and totally remaking cities so that you could place factories on
state-directed as in for the common good.
For the development of the capitalist economy, which had the consequences of general progression because the capitalist economy develops a working class that is alienated, knows it's alienated, is frustrated, and fights against it if it's organized. So that's like something that Marx even talks about in the manifesto, that you have that the creation of a capitalist economy creates a working class, and that working class is an agent of revolutionary change. So if it self-organizes, is self-conscious of itself as a revolutionary actor, can organize together to overtake the state and use the state to disintegrate the difference between people in terms of their ownership of the means of production and their working at the means of production, and they can play that role. So you have to have an organized industrial working class. You can't just have a bunch of people like we have right now, a disorganized working class, where we have a huge working class in the United States, but we're not bound together. We don't have an allegiance. This is like, hey, we're all just wage workers here. We don't have institutions that we can go to that we can say that are ours. All of them are institutions of the ruling class, the people who own things. So movies and television and all of that kind of stuff is all, even social media, are all these giant corporations that are attempting to steal our interests and get our money. And so if there's going to be progress and continued progress, it is only going to be because there's an organized working class. My fear is, the reason that I'm a techno pessimist, maybe you'd say, is because I don't see the organized working class right now. And I see the push of automation, an attempt by the ruling class to destroy the working class by eliminating their ability to work. And if you do that, the only bit of optimism I would have is that if you start pushing all the working class out of their jobs, what is a person who is unemployed and has no prospects to get another job going to do? They're going to start getting involved in illegal enterprises or revolutionary activities. That's what happens when you push a working. That's what happens when you used to have 1,000 weavers, and then you introduced an automated weaving machine, and all of a sudden 50 people get laid off. What do? The next week they come in with a baseball bat and destroy the fucking weaving machine. That's what used to happen in the Industrial Revolution. So these things have happened before. And that's always interesting. Like when people say when you're worried about automation, it's like, well, no, we've done this before. It's like, yeah, the last time it happened, millions of people fucking died, and you had major.
So automation
major
worries you.
Yeah, it worries me not in what it can give. It's like capitalism. Capitalism doesn't worry me in terms of what it can develop. It worries me in terms of what it will do if it isn't directed towards the right things.
Okay, I agree with that. But so then, do you see Andrew Yang, so to speak, as the Antichrist ushering in the end of times without thinking about automation? Or do you think positively.
I think it's very helpful that Andrew Yang is talking about the potential consequences of automation.
I
on the
agree with
working
you
class.
100%.
I don't think that the solution of a UBI is going to do anything about it. What the UBI is the acknowledgement of the ruling class's intent on destroying the working class, and for there to be a technocratic solution that says this is what the ruling class has to do in order to maintain the economy. Because the only way you make a profit is by exploiting human labor. If you stop exploiting human labor, you're not giving money to the person who is going to buy the commodity, right? If no one has a job, therefore everyone loses their source of income, every business loses its source of income because nobody has any money, right? So you need to pay people and have those people be consumers to generate any profit, to have the economy go at all. And so what Andrew Yang's UBI solution, what the UBI is saying, we just need a way to recycle the money. We need to put the money in the hands of the otherwise unemployable or unemployed working class so that they can buy the commodities that a fully automated capitalist enterprise will create. That's a solution. But if you want to talk about alienating people and you want to talk about sort of misdirecting, I mean, the only way that I could see this is if the UBI that you're given is enough to give you a luxury lifestyle. Right? Because if it's $12,000, it doesn't mean anything.
Well,
you're still in utter dog shit poverty if you make $12,000.
It's $12,000 more than you had would be the argument.
Yep, but it's $12,000 doesn't mean anything.
Especially
if you're going to do the UBI, it has to be $120,000, and you have to give it to everybody, and it's going to cost $300 trillion. But you could do it. But that would be how you
what?
suffice.
Wait a minute.
Yep.
What you have to blow it up by 100 times.
You'd have to create a recycling mechanism that takes basically the GDP and gives everybody let's say the mean or the average, right? So whatever the average GDP per capita is, everybody gets it. So in this case, it wouldn't be $12,000, it'd be 60, or 55 or whatever GDP per capita is at this point. So that would be a UBI that might work, because you probably could even have it more, but you'd have to be taking money. Your tax rate is going to be 100% over a certain amount, and if you have any competition in the capitalist world in terms of tax havens, then you lose all your money. And so this ability to provide a UBI solution would have to be around the world. It would have to destroy all tax havens and would have to be willing to charge everybody in the world 100% of their taxes above a certain amount. That's that to me is almost a more difficult proposition than a worldwide communist revolution. I just don't think that you're going to get the capitalist elite to agree to limit their money so that everybody can get free money because they've automated all of it away. Their ideology does not support that, and most people's ideology doesn't support it either. And so you're not fundamentally shifting who owns and controls production. You're just giving people money, and it's like an insult.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I never thought about it like that.
That's my thing. Like the UBI, originally I was way for it, and I think it's like, yeah, that's a great idea. Like, and I'm not saying that it wouldn't help. Mm-hmm. It would. I'm for it as a stopgap measure, but you got to give the criticism of the fact that it isn't dealing with the root problem, and the root problem is the ownership and control of the means of production. If you don't deal with that, mm-hmm. you'll never fix the problem. That's the problem.
Does enemy number one for you, is that Jeff Bezos?
Yeah.
And Elon Musk too.
Elon Musk is up there.
Yeah.
I appreciate,
even though you and me, we nerded out and we watched that Falcon Heavy launch replay.
Now, Elon Musk plays a different role than Jeff Bezos because Jeff Bezos doesn't work at Amazon. Right? What's Jeff Bezos? Jeff Bezos owns Amazon, but he's not the CEO of Amazon.
He's not in the warehouse running around getting your toothpaste.
No. Elon Musk is doing work.
Yeah. He's the head engineer of SpaceX.
That's his title. I mean, He's got a head engineering team. But
Word.
okay. But still,
we see you, Elon.
I have to give him credit for the fact that he does more than simply wait for the dividend check, which is different than a lot of people.
Yeah.
But there is a whole group of people in the United States, and there are not a lot of people, but there's enough of them where they literally don't do anything. And they wait for their mail. They just wait. They don't wait for the mail now. They just wait until they get the notice in their email that the dividends have been deposited.
Right, just the numbers in their bank account.
And they don't
just
worry about
go
it.
up.
And the numbers are huge.
No
and
doubt.
so you have somebody who's, our age, in their mid-30s, who have millions of dollars.
Well, there was this fantasy that I had when I was younger, and I still think about it, and I think it's not a bad idea. If just everyone in the world who's worth over $1 million, if they mailed me a check for $1, I'd be taken care of. I wouldn't have to worry about money.
Yeah, in principle, if we not only taxed the rich so that they could pay for things, but changed the structure of businesses so that you wouldn't be able to get money for free and that everybody'd have to work, we would be able to pay for so much cool shit. Everybody'd be able to go to school for free. You'd have all of the things you'd create, even in terms of a welfare state, the best fucking country in the world. It'd be like Denmark in the whole United States of America, especially here, because we're the richest country in the world. We're also the most unequal. So with a little bit of a tweak, we could do a lot of good. And with a pretty big tweak in terms of like turning all the businesses into worker cooperatives, we would be able to change the whole society in a way that would make it unrecognizable, I think, in a very short period of time. And would just live up to the ideals of freedom, liberty, and democracy.
So just to say that it works out, the transition period between what we have today and a well-functioning communist society, is that transition period, is that troubling to you at all? Because it's major, and it's going to disrupt so many things, not the least of which psychologically for people, it's going to be very difficult. Capitalism is baked into how we all think.
Yeah, it's there was around right before World War I, there was a sort of saying that it was either socialism or barbarism, and it was that kind of choice. And I think that we're coming back to that kind of choice in terms of the climate problem. That it's again socialism or barbarism. We have to change it, or the world is going to stay on, as Bill Nye described it, on fucking fire. And I think
I don't know. I don't really like Bill Nye anymore. To be real with you, but anyway.
I mean, the point being that the consequences of not doing something are worse than the potential consequences of what would happen in the revolutionary change. That's how I would feel about that. That there will be costs that will be paid during that 150-year period.
That's a long fucking time.
Yeah. It's
all
a
right.
long.
That's where I want to go next episode. Together. I think I want to explore the transition a little bit more.
Okay. Yeah. That is a whole thing. But yeah, think about this in terms of that period of time, though. That transition. It took 200 years for capitalism to fully go around the world and become the worldwide system. It happened, a few pieces at a time, but eventually it spread around the whole world. So it takes a while for these systems to come about and get created, So it's not unrealistic. There were people who thought that you could do it in 30 years. That's crazy and that's unrealistic. It's going to take 4 generations minimum before people stop having capitalism ingrained into their minds as the status quo, and to establish a new status quo. But so you have to have 4 generations of people who are willing to work towards that project. So the closest example of anyone who's tried to do something like that is Cuba. That they've engaged in a multi-generational project now to create some kind of example of a society that is based on, in general, socialistic principles. And it's not perfect, and they know that. There's problems. But it's an amazing example of what happens when a system like that can continue on, even in the face of severe economic, issues and things like that. That Cuba is an amazing country for that reason. And again, it's not like it doesn't have its problems, but it doesn't have gulags and all kinds of things. It's a decent country. And it's a decent country because it's taken 3 or 4 generations of people who've committed themselves to a revolutionary project that has created a much better country than they found it. So,
Yeah, it's a tough position to be in, to be the transition generation.
It is, but we are coming up against the wall of climate disaster. And if you look at the younger generation, the Greta Thunberg generation of people, that's a riled up group of people. And you have, yellow jackets in France and actions going on right now in all over Latin America, Africa, so.
Before we leave the Cuba piece, so you were saying that we should hold Cuba up as an example of a successful communist revolution?
No. I think that there are serious problems with Cuba's project for all kinds of reasons, not just because of Cuba's own policy decisions, namely that they can't trade with the biggest economy in the world that's 90 miles off their shore. But I'm saying that it's an example of what can happen in a few generations.
What has happened there?
A remaking of their society from what existed previous to 1960.
When does it get better for the average Cuban?
It's better for the average Cuban today than it was in 1960. I'll guarantee you that. Okay, for sure. I mean, there's been progress on the island, and that's come with the economic cost that Cuba's had to pay for not being a colony of the United States, which it was for a long time, since the 1890s. So it's, but I mean, I think the relationships that people have to each other, and even to the state and to people who are coming in from other places, because they have a lot of people who go to Cuba because it's beautiful, and they have universal literacy, universal access to healthcare, universal education, universal housing. There are no homeless people in Cuba, I'm pretty sure. And so, but that might be because they have vagrancy laws, So it's not perfect, but there's a lot in terms of Cuba that there is to be proud of. There's things to be ashamed of, but again, not to be lame, but compared to the genocide of the Native American people and the enslavement of black people and, those kinds of things, the comparative sins of communist Cuba and the United States of America are pretty slim.
Point well taken.
I appreciate you being on.
Thanks, Kevin. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks, man.